The call came on a Tuesday. I remember because I had just gotten back from my cardiologist appointment and was sitting in my recliner with a glass of iced tea watching the news with the volume turned low. My phone buzzed on the side table. Unknown number. I almost let it go to voicemail. Is this Edmund Hale? It is, I said. Mr. Hale, this is Glenbrook Elementary School in Medford calling. We have a child here who has not been picked up. Her emergency contact on file is your name and number. We've been trying to reach her mother since 2 o'clock and it's now past 5. I sat up straight. The iced tea nearly tipped off the armrest. I think there's been a mistake, I said. I don't have grandchildren. My wife passed 4 years ago. I live alone. The woman on the other end paused. Sir, the emergency contact card was filled out by Nora Calloway. It lists you as Edmund Hale, grandfather. The little girl's name is Iris. She's 6 years old and she's been sitting in the front office for 3 hours. She keeps asking for you by name. I didn't know anyone named Nora Calloway. I told the woman that. She put me on hold. I sat there with the television flickering in front of me. Some senator talking about something I couldn't follow anymore. I was 63 years old, retired, a former high school history teacher from Medford, Oregon. I had one daughter who lived in Phoenix, and we talked every Sunday. I had a bad knee and a small vegetable garden, and a black Labrador named Chester who was getting too old to fetch. The woman came back on. Mr. Hale, I understand this is confusing, but I do need to let you know that if no authorized adult comes to pick up this child, we're required to contact Child Protective Services. How far is the school from Riverside Drive? About 2 miles. I put on my jacket. The school office smelled like copy paper and hand sanitizer. A young secretary looked up when I came through the door, and before she could say a word, I heard a sound from the corner of the room. A small girl sitting in a plastic chair with a backpack shaped like a ladybug looked up at me. She had dark brown hair and 2 uneven braids, like someone had tried their best but wasn't practiced at it. She had a stuffed rabbit tucked under one arm. She looked at me for about 2 seconds. Then she slid off the chair and walked straight to me like she'd done it 100 times before, and wrapped both arms around my waist. Grandpa Ed, she said into my jacket, I knew you'd come. I stood there with my hands at my sides, not knowing where to put them. The secretary was watching me carefully. The principal, a younger man in his 40s, stepped out from the back office and introduced himself. I shook his hand on autopilot. I was still looking down at this little girl who was holding on to me like I was something she'd been waiting for. Do you know her? The principal asked quietly. I don't know, I said honestly. I don't think so, but she seems to know me. They let me sit down with her in a small conference room. She sat across from me at a table that was too big for her and set her rabbit on the surface like she was introducing us. That's Clover, she said. Nice to meet Clover, I said. She looked at me the way kids look at you when they're deciding if you're safe. Steady, unblinking, serious in a way that was too old for a face. Mama said if she ever didn't come to get me, I was supposed to wait for Grandpa Ed. When did she tell you that? A long time ago. She thought about it. And also last week. I asked her where her mama was. She said she didn't know. She said her mama had been sad lately. She said she'd been sleeping a lot. I felt something cold move through me then, quiet and slow. I told the principal I needed to make a phone call. I stepped into the hallway and called my daughter in Phoenix and told her what was happening. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, Dad, are you sure you don't know who this is? I'm sure. Think back. Think hard. I thought hard. I had been married to my wife Margaret for 31 years before she got sick. We had our daughter together. I had never been unfaithful to my wife. Not once. I was not that kind of man, and I knew it with the certainty of someone who had been tested a few times in his life and had always chosen to walk away. But then something else surfaced. Something from a long time ago, before Margaret, before any of it. I was 22 years old and living in Eugene, working at a lumberyard the summer after I dropped out of my first attempt at college. I was lost that summer, drifting the way young men drift when they haven't found their direction yet. I had a friend who knew a girl who knew another girl, and that's how I met a woman named Caroline. Caroline was 25, a waitress, funny in a sharp-edged way that I wasn't used to. We spent about 2 months together that summer. Nothing serious, or so I told myself. She was restless. I was restless. It ended when she told me she was moving to Portland to stay with her sister. We didn't exchange more than a phone number, and neither of us called. I hadn't thought about Caroline in probably 30 years, but she had a last name. It was Calloway. I walked back into the conference room. Iris was drawing something on a piece of scratch paper the secretary had given her. A house with a big tree and a dog. Does your mama have any family? I asked her. Aunts, uncles, grandparents, Grandma Bet? She said without looking up. But she's in a home. She doesn't always remember things. What about your daddy? She kept drawing. I don't have a daddy. She said it so matter-of-factly, not with sadness exactly. Just the way you state a fact you've known your whole life. I sat there looking at this child for a long moment. She had dark hair. So did Caroline. So did I, once, before it went white. She had brown eyes. I have brown eyes. I have brown eyes. I told the principal I was taking her home for the night while we figured things out. They were hesitant. I understood that, but I had identification. My name was on the emergency contact card, and there was genuinely nowhere else for her to go that evening unless they called CPS. They made me fill out 2 forms and sign 3 times, and the principal watched me with the particular wariness of a man doing his best in an ambiguous situation. Iris took my hand in the parking lot without being asked. Chester went absolutely insane when we got home. He's old and arthritic, but he still managed to wiggle the full length of his body when he saw a small person walk through the door. Iris laughed, a real surprised laugh that sounded like water, and sat down cross-legged on the floor to let him lick her face. I stood in my kitchen and tried to figure out what a 6-year-old eats for dinner. I found some pasta and a jar of marinara sauce and some frozen peas. She ate the whole bowl and asked for more. After dinner, she asked if she could watch something on TV. I found a cartoon. She asked if she could watch something on TV. I found a cartoon. She sat on the couch with Chester's head in her lap and Clover the rabbit under her arm, and she was asleep within 20 minutes. I covered her with the blanket my wife used to keep on the back of the couch. I stood there looking at her for a long time. Then I went to the kitchen table and tried to think about what to do next. I found Nora Calloway the next morning. A neighbor of hers had called the school themselves. It turned out they'd noticed the lights on in her apartment all night and hadn't seen her leave. The police did a welfare check. Nora was alive. She was in the hospital. She had taken too many of her prescription pills, not accidentally. She was 40 years old. She was Caroline Calloway's daughter. That made her Iris's mother, and it made Caroline Calloway her grandmother. The Grandma Bet in the memory care facility, that was Caroline's mother, Iris's great-grandmother. The math was simple, and it hit me like stepping off a curb you didn't know was there. If Caroline had gotten pregnant that summer in Eugene, she would have been 25. Nora would have been born the following year. And Nora, at 40, had a 6-year-old daughter. I was the only name on that emergency contact card. I am not a man who panics. I taught high school for 28 years. I've seen kids fall apart, families fall apart. I've sat with students in crisis, and I've learned to keep my voice steady when everything else isn't. But I sat at my kitchen table that morning with my coffee going cold, and I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. The specific vertigo of realizing that your past has been living its own life without your knowledge. A social worker called me that afternoon. A young woman named someone I immediately forgot because I was too busy trying to follow everything she was saying. Nora was stable. She would be in the hospital for at least 72 hours, then moved to an inpatient psychiatric facility for evaluation. She had no family who could take Iris in the short term. Grandma Bet was not capable of that kind of care. There were no other names on any contact list anywhere, except mine. Mr. Hale, the social worker said, I want to be clear that there's no legal obligation here. You can decline. We can place Iris in emergency foster care while we work through the family situation. I looked into the living room. Iris was on the floor with Chester, telling him something very seriously, holding Clover up for him to look at. How long would that take? I asked. It's hard to say. Could be weeks. Could be longer. I asked her to give me a day to make some calls. I called my daughter. She listened to everything without interrupting, which is something she learned from her mother. And when I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Dad, she said, do you think she's actually related to you? I don't know. It's possible. More than possible, sounds like. Yes. What do you want to do? That was the question. What did I want to do? I was 63 years old with a bad knee and a slow dog and a garden and a quiet life I had built very deliberately after Margaret died, because quiet was what I needed. I had not planned for this. I want to talk to Nora, I said, when she's able. And in the meantime, I said, I'm not putting a 6-year-old in emergency foster care if I have a choice. My daughter flew up from Phoenix 2 days later. She arrived with a duffel bag full of groceries and immediately started reorganizing my pantry, which is her way of managing anxiety. She and Iris took to each other with a speed that surprised me. By the second morning, they were making pancakes together, and my daughter was showing Iris how to flip them, and the kitchen was a mess of flour. And I sat at the table drinking my coffee, thinking about how strange life is, how it hides whole rooms from you that you didn't know were there. On the fourth day, the hospital allowed a brief supervised phone call with Nora. Her voice was thin and flat in the way of someone who is very medicated and also very ashamed. She thanked me for taking Iris. She apologized. I told her there was nothing to apologize for and meant it. I asked her about Caroline. There was a long silence. She told me about you, Nora said finally. She said she'd made a mistake, leaving Eugene. She said you were a good man. She never reached out. No. Another silence. She was proud. She didn't want to ask anything of anyone. She raised me by herself, and she was proud of it. But she kept your number, even when it probably didn't work anymore. She looked you up once when I was about 12. Found out you were a teacher in Medford. She said she drove past the school. I didn't know what to say to that. When Iris was born, Nora continued, I didn't have anyone. Her father was. He wasn't someone who was going to be present. Mom was already starting to lose her memory. I looked you up the same way she did. You were retired, but I found your address. I put you down as the only person I could think of who might actually show up. Why didn't you call me? Because what would I say? Her voice broke a little on that. Hey, this is the daughter of the woman you dated for 2 months 40 years ago. Can you be my emergency contact? You'd have thought I was crazy. I might have, I said, but I would have listened. She was quiet. Caroline died 2 years ago, she said. Breast cancer. It was fast. I sat with that for a moment. A woman I had spent one summer with, a woman I hadn't thought about in decades, had lived a whole life and then ended it without me knowing, had kept my name somewhere in her memory, had told her daughter I was a good man. Is Iris mine? I asked. Biologically, I mean. Are you my daughter? The silence stretched long enough that I counted my own heartbeats. I don't know for certain, Nora said. Mom told me my father was someone she'd known briefly. She never said the name, but you kept your information for 40 years, and when I needed a name, yours was the only one I had. After that call, my daughter and I sat at the kitchen table while Iris napped, and we talked for 2 hours. She cried a little. I didn't, but I felt the weight of it behind my eyes in a way I hadn't in some time. We talked about practicalities, what a temporary guardianship would mean, what it would look like when Nora recovered and was discharged, what Iris would need for school, and who would handle pickups, and whether my old Subaru was reliable enough, or whether we needed to talk about car seats. We talked about the DNA question. My daughter, who was practical in the best possible way, said we should get a test when the time was right. Not to change anything about how we behaved right now, but to know. Because knowing was better than not knowing generally. I agreed, but I also said this, and I meant it. It didn't change anything today. That little girl had been sitting in a school office for 3 hours with a stuffed rabbit and a ladybug backpack. She had called me Grandpa Ed like she'd rehearsed it her whole life. She had eaten 2 bowls of pasta in my kitchen and told my arthritic dog secrets and fallen asleep under my wife's blanket. Whatever the biology said, the question of what I was going to do had already been answered the moment I put on my jacket. The next weeks were not easy. I will not pretend otherwise. Emergency guardianship paperwork is not designed with 63-year-old retired teachers in mind. My house was not set up for a child. I had to buy a bed. I had to child-proof things I had not thought about in decades. I had to figure out school drop-off and pick-up on my own once my daughter went back to Phoenix. I was tired in ways I had forgotten you could be tired. I burned dinner twice. I bought the wrong kind of juice 3 times before Iris told me with great patience that she preferred apple, not orange, and that orange juice has a mean taste. But there were other things. There was the evening she asked me to read to her, and I found one of my daughter's old books in the closet, a battered copy of Charlotte's Web, and I read 3 chapters out loud while she lay with her head on Chester's flank. When I got to the part where Charlotte dies, her face crumpled in a way that I recognized grief happening for the first time, the shock that things can end, and I stopped reading and just held her for a while. There was the morning she helped me water the tomato plants and asked with complete seriousness whether tomatoes were fruits or vegetables, and spent the rest of the day insisting to Chester that they were fruits. There was the Saturday morning my daughter came back up for a visit, and the 3 of us, my daughter Iris and I, went to the farmer's market on Oak Street, and Iris held my hand the whole way, and a woman I'd taught with years ago saw us and said, "Is that your granddaughter?" And I looked down at Iris and I said, "Yes." I didn't explain. It didn't feel like an explanation was required. The DNA test came back 6 weeks later. Nora was my daughter. I sat in my kitchen with the results on my phone, and I thought about Caroline Calloway, 25 years old in Eugene, Oregon, working the lunch shift, laughing at something I'd said. I thought about all the years between then and now. I thought about my wife, would have known exactly what to feel about this, and would have told me in about 30 seconds the way she always cut straight through my overthinking. I thought about Iris. Then I called my daughter in Phoenix. She picked up on the second ring. "Well," she said. "She's my daughter," I said. "Nora is my daughter." A long pause. Then, "So Iris is your granddaughter?" "Yes." Another pause. I could hear her breathing. "I have a sister," she said quietly. "You have a sister," said quietly. "You have a sister," I said. She cried. I'm not ashamed to say I cried too. We stayed on the phone for an hour saying very little, and it was one of the better hours I've had in a long time. Nora was discharged from the inpatient program 10 weeks after she'd been admitted. She was not fully well. That is not how these things work, I had learned. But she was stable. She had a plan. She had a therapist and a medication that was starting to help. She moved into a small apartment about 4 miles from my house. We did not rush anything. That was the agreement, mine and hers. She saw Iris 3 times a week at first, then 4, then 5. I stayed in the picture because Iris wanted me to, because Nora wanted me to, and because I was, as it turned out, the closest thing to a grandfather Iris had ever had. On a Wednesday evening in late October, Nora came over for dinner. My daughter was visiting again. The 4 of us ate at my kitchen table, pasta, because Iris had requested it. And Chester sat underneath, hoping someone would drop something. And Iris told us about a project she was doing at school about animals. And it was loud in a way my house had not been loud in a very long time. After dinner, while Nora and my daughter did the dishes and argued cheerfully about something I couldn't follow, Iris came and found me in my recliner. She climbed up and sat beside me. There's just barely room for both of us, and looked at the TV, which I'd left on with the volume down. "Grandpa Ed," she said. "Yeah? Are we a family?" I thought about that for a moment. The sounds coming from my kitchen, Chester's tail thumping on the floor, the October dark outside the window. "Yeah," I said. "I think we are." She thought about that. "Good," she said. "I think we are." She thought about that. "Good," she said. Then she leaned against my arm and looked at the TV. And that was the end of the conversation, the way conversations with 6-year-olds end completely, without ceremony, totally satisfied. I sat there in my recliner in my house in Medford, Oregon, with this child pressed against my arm, and I thought about a phone call on a Tuesday that I almost didn't answer. I'm glad I picked up. I keep coming back to the moment I almost didn't answer that call. Unknown number. Tuesday afternoon. I was tired from the doctor, and the iced tea was cold, and the news was on low, and my whole life was quiet in the way I had worked very hard to make it quiet. One tap of a finger, and it would have gone to voicemail. One small choice in the other direction, and Iris would have sat in that school office until a stranger from the county came to collect her. That's the part I can't stop thinking about. not the big dramatic moments, not the DNA results, not the phone call with Nora, not the night I covered Iris with Margaret's blanket. Just that one ordinary Tuesday second when I could have let it ring. I've thought a lot about what made me pick up. I don't think it was anything special about me. I think it was just a habit built over 63 years of showing up when something asked you to. My father had it. Margaret had it. You don't call it courage in the moment. It doesn't feel like anything in the moment, but it accumulates into something over time, a kind of character, the decision to answer the phone before you know what's on the other end. Nora had put my name on that card because her mother told her I was a good man. Caroline never called me, never asked me for anything, but she watched quietly from a distance for 40 years, and she decided, based on one summer when we were both young and unfinished, that I was someone worth trusting in an emergency. I don't take that lightly. I hope I've earned it, even retroactively. What I know is this: the people who end up meaning something to each other are not always the people who plan to. Nora didn't plan for any of this. Neither did I. But she had the clarity, even at her lowest, even when she was barely holding on, to think ahead to Iris, to make sure someone would show up. That took a kind of wisdom that I think gets overlooked because it came wrapped in crisis. She knew her own limits, and she made a plan anyway. That's not weakness. That's the opposite of weakness. And Iris, 6 years old, sitting alone in a plastic chair for 3 hours, and when I walked through that door, she didn't cry or panic. She just got up and walked to me like the situation had already been resolved, and someone had simply forgotten to tell the room. I don't know where children get that kind of steadiness. Maybe they get it from necessity. Maybe it's just who she is. But I watch her and I think about what it means to face something uncertain and decide to trust it anyway. She trusted me before she had any real reason to. I've been trying to be worthy of that ever since. I'm not the same man who sat down in that recliner on a Tuesday afternoon thinking his life was settled. My knee still aches. Chester is still slow. The garden still needs watering. But there's a small person who calls me Grandpa Ed and argues with the dog about whether tomatoes are fruits. And every morning I have to get up and be someone worth calling that. It turns out that's exactly the right amount of reason to keep going.